Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar, High School Modeling Best Practices for Implementing High-Intensity Tasks for All Students. I'm just going to give everyone a few minutes to join, and then we'll get right back to you. Hello, everyone. Hopefully everybody's had the chance to sign in. Welcome to this evening's webinar, High School Modeling Best Practices for Implementing High-Intensity Tasks for All Students. My name is Pascal Joseph. I am a project coordinator with the Tools and Classroom Resources team here at the Student Achievement Partners. And this month's presenters are Barbara Besky, a senior mathematics specialist with the Tools and Classroom Resources team at SAP, Scott Meltzer, director of mathematics at American Paradigm Schools, R.P. Leginian, teacher of mathematics and instructional coach at Northern Valley Regional High School at Old Tappan, New Jersey, and Kate Nowak, director of K-12 curriculum strategy at Illustrative Mathematics. Before we get started, we always like to poll our audience and find out how many Core Advocate webinars have you attended. So just take a couple seconds to provide us with a response, and we'll see whether this is everyone's first time or how many have been here for quite a few times. Okay, we have quite a few first-timers. Wow, welcome, and thank you for participating with us this evening. I think one of the things that we always like to encourage people to do is join our Core Advocate Network. You can sign up here at this link, especially if you found tonight's webinar very helpful. You'll be connected to a network of other professionals who can help you and gain other opportunities that meet your needs and interests. And if you want to learn even more about us, please feel free to contact Jenny Beltramini or Joy DeLizo Osborne, and they would be happy to answer any questions that you have about the organization or any of our resources. Here we also have a survey link so that you can join our mailing list and database. Feel free to tweet with us too this evening, especially during the entire webinar. If you have any questions, if you want to share what you're learning, feel free to tweet at Achieve the Core. You can also tweet our presenters. All of their Twitter names are right here on the screen. And I just want to direct everybody to all the tools of engagement during the webinar. There is a purple Q&A box, a green resources box, and that is where you'll find all the resources that are referred to during this webinar. And also feel free to access the group chat. That is where you could talk to everyone, all of the attendees that are here in the webinar, and reach out. Maybe you can meet some new partners during the networking process. And now I'd like to introduce Barbara Besky.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. So glad to have you with us tonight. Want to jump right into some of the goals. So hopefully tonight we're going to have a chance to develop a deeper understanding of what it means to model with mathematics. We're going to investigate some of the connections between modeling and equity, discuss some best practices for implementing modeling, and learn where to find some free modeling tasks. So what is modeling? We know that modeling with mathematics is a standard for mathematical practice, MP4. And MP4 is an expectation across K through 12. if we kind of unpack some of the language that's in the standards around this standard for mathematical practice, we see some key words pop up. Words like apply, everyday life, problems in the community, planning school events, solving a design problem, practical situations, and interpret mathematical results in the context of the situation. When we think about some of those key phrases, a definition that pops into mind is modeling with mathematics means applying mathematics to solve a problem in context. So we know, again, that modeling as a mathematical practice spans K-12, but we also see in high school that modeling gets elevated to also be a conceptual category. We're going to hear more about that tonight, but just wanted to flag that as something that we're thinking about, not only as modeling as a standard for mathematical practice, but also what does it mean in high school specifically as a conceptual category. The GAME report, GAME stands for Guidelines for Assessment and Instruction in Mathematical Modeling Education. They released a second edition of the report in February of 2019, and I believe you can find that PDF. It's a free PDF in your resources tab. They define modeling as a process that uses mathematics to represent, analyze, make predictions, or otherwise provide insight into real-world phenomena. So again, using mathematics to solve real-world problems. Because modeling means applying math to solve a problem in context, we want to make sure that we're thinking about what does that look like in tasks. So here are some hallmarks, some ideas for modeling tasks that we'll be investigating. We know that the math techniques in a modeling task are not going to necessarily be stated explicitly. We know that students might need to come up with some assumptions. They might not be explicitly stated in the problem, and sometimes the different assumptions students make may also be considered reasonable. Not just, there's not a right answer, one correct assumption, for instance. We know that a good modeling task is going to involve making some decisions about things. They might require some optimization. And the context is not a pretext. As we just saw in those definitions, the context is really about solving, using mathematics that they know to solve a situation or phenomenon in hand. And that phenomenon or situation is actually interesting. It's worthwhile. Kids want to do it. It's beyond just doing math for the math classroom. So I'd love to just poll you again real quickly. I'm interested in how often modeling is happening in your setting. So none at all, rarely. It depends on the students or the courses you're teaching. It depends on the teacher, or all students experience modeling on a regular basis. Go ahead and click one that describes your setting and hit submit. So we have a real variety in the room. Look at that bell curve, very nice. So we see that about 40% of you are saying not at all or rarely, and then another large chunk of you saying it depends, with a very small percentage really seeing modeling happen on a regular basis. So let's continue. So as you're listening tonight, I'd love for you to keep some of these ideas in mind, especially if modeling is new for you or for your students, or that even if it's modeling's happening a little bit, but it's relatively new. So one is, as you're hearing all the different suggestions, just remember to start small. You don't have to take on everything that modeling is all at one time. We want to think about scaffolding experiences for students by providing some leading questions, providing discussion as a whole class, Again, thinking about the students' everyday experiences to motivate the modeling, knowing as you hear about the modeling cycle that you may want to choose scenarios that only require you to use a few of the stages of the modeling cycle, not the full cycle. And you may want to think about who you're going to share that you're kicking this off with, maybe your parents, administrators, etc. The NCTM has a paper about mathematical modeling in high school curriculum. This is also in your resources tab that I thought had some great questions that I'd like you to also consider as you're hearing about modeling tonight. As you are planning for modeling, here are just a great group of questions to just make the best out of the experience. So you might want to be asking yourself, what kind of questions do I think the students are going to have about the context of the task? What information are they going to need? Where am I going to allow them to get that information? What assumptions are they going to have to make? If they're not used to making assumptions, you might really need to think about how are you going to help them feel comfortable doing so. What strategies do you think students are going to use? How are you going to balance individual work, small group work, whole class discussions? Where do you think students are going to get stuck, and then what are you going to do in that moment? Particularly in the next bullet, what are you going to do without taking over the modeling process? So what kind of questions can you provide to help get over some of those barriers of when students are like, I don't know what to do next, without taking over and taking the modeling opportunities away from them? And then also, like, what tools will students need to use? These are great questions for you to consider as you plan for to do more modeling. And important to note that the answers to these questions are going to be different depending on your students and you. But by thinking through them during the planning process, it'll really help you feel more prepared and will also help structure how modeling will take place in the classroom. So now I'd like to pass the mic on to Scott Meltzer, who's going to share more about modeling and the high school standards.
Thank you, Barbara. It's great to see so many people here learning about modeling with us tonight. So as Barbara mentioned, modeling in the K-12 Standards for Mathematical Practice, it's one of the 8 Standards for Mathematical Practice. But in high school, it really takes on a different role. And so for the next few minutes, we're going to dig into this question of how does modeling fit within the context of the high school standards. And again, Barbara showed this graphic a few minutes ago. There are these 6 conceptual categories in the high school standards, and modeling is one of the 6. If you're familiar with the Coherence map, or if you're not, this is a great little orientation to it. This is the page that shows the 6 conceptual categories from high school mathematics. So you have number and quantity, algebra, functions, modeling, geometry, and statistics and probability. The layout of this page really shows that these 6 conceptual categories are meant to be sort of equal and to have sort of equal attention throughout the high school curriculum. But within the 6 categories, modeling is very unique. So if we look at a sample standard from the standard or from each conceptual category, you'll notice modeling doesn't actually have a standard. And that's because modeling doesn't have any content standards of its own. The modeling standards are distributed throughout the other 5 conceptual categories. So the standards that I have listed here are all examples of modeling standards. We're going to dig into one of these modeling standards for a few minutes, and then we'll come back to this page in order to get a kind of bigger picture view of how modeling functions as a conceptual category. So FTFB5, this is the page for this standard from the Coherence map. This is a standard from the functions conceptual category, and TF stands for the domain of trigonometric functions. This standard requires students to choose trigonometric functions to model periodic phenomena with specified amplitude, frequency, and midline. The key word, of course, in the standard is model. And as you can see on the Coherence map, there's that asterisk that indicates that this is a modeling standard. It means that when students are learning this standard, it's really important that for them to pay attention to the modeling aspects of the standard and to engage in parts of the modeling cycle when they're working with this standard. We can see an example of how they can do that if we look a little bit lower on that page, we can see a sample task for this standard. So this is Hours of Daylight. It's a task from Illustrative Mathematics. And it asks students to choose a location on Earth and research some data and create a mathematical model, a function that models the amount of daylight at that location over the course of the year. This task sort of exemplifies some of the hallmarks that Barbara mentioned of a modeling task. Students have to make assumptions by choosing a location, and the context itself is genuine, and it's the focus of the problem. It's not a pretext for getting at the mathematics. A task like this gives students opportunities to engage in some phases of the modeling cycle, which we're going to hear a little bit more about in a few more minutes. Modeling standards like FTF B5 appear throughout these 5 conceptual categories. But again, modeling is a conceptual category of its own, and it really represents more than sort of the sum of those disparate standards. If we click on modeling within the coherence map, we'll get to this page, which gives a lot more information that I highly recommend you read if you have time. On the left, there's some general information about modeling and about the modeling cycle, which RP is going to get into. On the right, there's access to a whole collection of modeling tasks that vary quite a bit in intensity, focus, content. So if you've ever had a student ask you, when are we ever going to need this? You can probably relate to this quote from Lynn Steen, who writes, high schools focus on elementary applications of advanced mathematics, whereas most people really make more use of sophisticated applications of elementary mathematics. Many who master high school mathematics cannot think clearly about percentages or ratios. I know that's true about a lot of the adults that I know. They don't really have a strong command of some of the most basic mathematics that is really important in real life. And yet in high school, we spend a lot of time focusing on mathematics that many students won't need in their everyday lives, most adults won't need, and even many careers won't require. Not that it's not worth learning, it's absolutely important. But what's really important in the standards is making sure that by the time they're done with high school, they have everything that they're going to need moving forward. So one way that we address this is through the publisher's criteria for the high school Common Core. This table represents some of the widely applicable prerequisite content, some of the most important standards in the high school curriculum. And the first 5 columns represent those 5 conceptual categories that have content standards in them, and really name the standards that deserve the most attention and the highest priority. The rightmost column tells us that it's really important for students to apply key takeaways from grades 6 through 8 at a level of sophistication that's appropriate for high school. So in other words, all of that ratios and proportions and percentages, unit conversions, functions, geometry, stats and probability, and rational number operations that students spend their middle school years studying, in high school, we need to take those concepts and bring them to a level of complexity that's going to really prepare them for what's coming up in their futures. So one way we do this is through high-intensity modeling tasks. When we think about modeling tasks, there's really kind of a spectrum of intensity and focus that those tasks sort of fall into. So on the low-intensity end, which is not to say easy, but low intensity, you have tasks like the Hours of Daylight task we looked at that really focus on mathematics that students are learning in the moment, where the modeling demands are not as complex as they could be. Students maybe don't need to engage in every single part of the modeling process because they're really focusing on mastering the mathematics that they're learning at the same time. So the context is important, the assumptions or the decisions are important, but the focus is really on learning that mathematical content. On the other end of the spectrum, we have some high-intensity tasks, which typically focus on content that students have learned in previous grade levels. And these tasks give students an opportunity to solidify that understanding, but also to really focus most of their attention on the modeling process. And this is where the modeling process can become really intense because the mathematics they're using is more familiar to them. This also creates equity for many students who have unfinished learning because it gives them more opportunities to dig into really important mathematics that they've seen in previous courses. So tasks like this are called high expertise content lagged applications, or HECLA tasks. And we're going to see an example of that in just a moment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to RP, who's going to walk us through a tour of one task and show us the steps of the modeling process. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone. I'm truly excited to be here with you to dive into the attributes of mathematical modeling. So what are the hallmarks of the modeling cycle? This diagram appears with the modeling standard, and it is meant to guide our high school students as they hopefully and happily engage deeply with modeling tasks. During the 10 minutes that I have, I will describe each component of the cycle, then illustrate using one of the modeling tasks from Achieve the Core. The task is Kamataka, and you can download it from the Resource tab. I've selected this task because it demonstrates all the hallmarks of the modeling cycle. So the entry point to the modeling cycle is, of course, the problem. This is where students really make sense of the real-world context of the task, and if there's a question that they need to answer, they need to identify the question. This is where, in a way, they decompose the problem. They also identify quantities that are relevant to the situation and choose their variables. They may also make assumptions about other variables that they might decide to exclude from their model. Now, let's illustrate the stage with Kamataka. So what is the context of this task? Kamataka is a state in southwest India, and we're given agricultural data from that region on fertilizer use and grain crop yields for years between 1956 and 1989. There's additional detail about the units. Fertilizer is measured in 100,000 tons and crop yield in 10 kilograms per hectare. So at this point, maybe students might wonder, and maybe you're wondering, what is a hectare? Actually, you have to look it up. So 1 hectare is 10,000 square meters. And here's an opportunity to help students visualize what 10,000 square meters looks like. Maybe you draw a square that's 100 meters by 100 meters and try to help them visualize that as part of an agricultural field, let's say. So something else we can do is ask students questions like, for the year 1956, look at the data for 1956. What do the 0.06 and 52.3 mean in the table? Now, you notice that there are units, of course, in the table. And one interpretation would be that in 1956, 6,000 tons of fertilizer were used in the region, and the crop yield was 723 kilograms per hectare. Now, the 6,000 tons of fertilizer are used in the entire region, but the 523 kilograms are the yield or represents the yields from 1 hectare. Well, now that we've looked at the context and made some sense of the data, maybe now we can look for the question. I don't have the question on this screen. If you have downloaded the task, you can see it as the question posed in part 1. But the task will ask for the function that models the relationship between fertilizer use and crop yield. Now, as students consider this, they might realize that crop yield depends on many other factors. And this is where the assumptions come in. Well, one of the assumptions is actually stated in the task, that the amount of land in cultivation remains fairly constant. However, there's no information about other variables. For instance, weather patterns or irrigation practices or pesticide use, or whether the composition of the fertilizer stayed the same throughout the year. So there's so many opportunities for students to kind of wonder and also make assumptions. Are they going to hold these variables fixed? How are they going to proceed? So back to the modeling cycle. We looked at the problem. Once the students have familiarized themselves with the context, they try to formulate a model. They look for patterns, make decisions about appropriate mathematical tools, and those tools could be flowcharts, diagrams, maybe cables, additional cables, graphs, geometric shapes, relations, and so on. So let's see what this looks like in our task. Since we're looking to see how fertilizer use and crop yield are related, I've actually plotted a scatter plot for the data. This is for yield versus fertilizer. Now, what pattern do you notice? I see a quadratic trend here. And I also noticed that there's this data point that pulls out of the bulk of the data, and I'm going to keep an eye on that. That's the data from 1970. Now, still with the task and formulating, in part one of the task, as I told you earlier, the students are asked to find a function, but the prompt does not really specify what type of function. Now, here's a quadratic curve that I fit through the data. Again, I used Desmos for this, but any graphing calculator could produce this. And I decided to exclude the data from 1970. Now, students can delete data points. They can add them back depending on the flexibility of the tool that they use. It's easy to do this stuff in Desmos. And they can even try different functions, right? I use the quadratic model, so here's the function that I have for it. Whatever they do here really depends on their prior knowledge in algebra. Some students might choose a linear model if they haven't learned quadratics. A quadratic curve really fits the data nicely here. Now that students have formulated a model, they will use it to perform operations and calculations and draw conclusions. This is the computing stage. So back to the task. In part two, you notice that students are asked to use their model to predict the crop yield when 500,000 tons of fertilizer are used. Well, to do this successfully, I think you realize that the students should take the 500,000 and recognize that they have to input 5 into the function that they created. So there's interpretation happening there, even before we get to the interpretation stage. The next attribute of the modeling cycle is the interpretation, which really refers to making sense of the answer that they get. Now, our students put 5 into the equation, and they're going to get 96.154. What is the meaning of 96.154? Well, to translate this value using the context and terminology of the task, we can say that 96.154 is equivalent to a yield of 961.54 tons of grain per hectare of farmed land. So this really is the interpretation stage in the modeling cycle. To recap, at this point, our students have really dug into the problem. They've created a model and used it to calculate a value. This is really a good time for them to decide whether the value they found makes sense in the context of the problem. And it's also time for them to ask questions like, does the solution make sense? I mean, is this number reasonable? Are the results practical in some other setting than the one we're looking at? And most importantly, can the model be improved? This is really when the students are assessing their solution and they're trying to validate their model. If the model can be improved, they return to formulating a new model, using it to compute, again, the answer, then interpret and validate again, and hopefully find a better model with more reliable results. This here is why the process, we call the process the modeling cycle, and cycle through this until they're really happy with the model that they end up with. So in part 3 of the task, students are assessing their predictions. This is actually a form of validation. Now notice that the data point from 1984 is pretty close to 5. That's the data from 4.8 is the data from 1984. And our prediction seems reasonable. And we can also say that it is likely an underestimate of the true yield because the curve really is below the data point that's near the 5 that we have for the independent variable. For students who know to interpret residuals, they can analyze them and assess the quality of the model. And this is where the more sophisticated students are going to look at that residual plot and determine whether the model is good or whether they can improve it. So, of course, at the end of the cycle, the students need to report their findings, conclusions, and the reasoning that led to the conclusions. Their report might include maybe a description of the context, the assumptions that they made, the model they created, conclusions that they reached, and maybe recommendations. And in part 4 of the task that I'm using to illustrate this, students need to report their findings before they can give advice, of course. And they might conclude that using more than 500,000 tons of fertilizer does not increase yield, and maybe recommend that the government look into other variables that they assume to be fixed while creating their model. So the report really concludes the modeling cycle, and I hope that this helps some of you make sense of the attributes of this modeling cycle. I really want to note that even though there might be similarities between modeling tasks, it is really important to recognize that mathematical modeling is not procedural. The modeling cycle provides a framework that captures the structure of the process. And the task that I use is only one example, and it is not a template for other high-intensity tasks. Tasks that you will find by going to the high school coherence map at Achieve the Core. As Scott shared earlier, this is where they are. So thank you for your attention, and now back to Barbara.
Great, thanks, RP. I wanted to pause for a second, do one more poll. Which of the following are true? All stages of the modeling cycle must occur in every modeling task. The validation stage may result in students creating a new model. Modeling tasks need to be aligned to particular standards. And modeling tasks are meant to solve interesting problems. Go ahead and select all that apply and hit submit. Great. So yeah, we know that not every modeling task needs to go through all the stages of the modeling cycle. Fantastic. We know the validation stage often results, as RP shared, with a need to revisit the model and kind of revisit the whole process. Modeling tasks actually do not need to be aligned to particular standards. One of the interesting things about modeling as a conceptual category is that modeling itself can be the content. We can use modeling, as Scott had mentioned, to address unfinished learning from middle school, or even just middle school topics that need to be brought in to be thought about at a higher level of sophistication, particularly that work around proportional relationships and ratio and percent. And another idea around modeling that makes it so interesting is that students may approach the task and the problem not in the same way. So it won't necessarily be aligned to a particular standard, but instead allow students to bring in the mathematics that they know. That being said, we know that there are standards, as Scott mentioned with the STAR, that require modeling for those standards themselves. And finally, yeah, modeling tasks are meant to solve interesting problems. We had a few people write in like, is Karnataka the most interesting problem? Maybe not. We wanted to highlight it because of how it really addresses all the stages, and definitely worth checking out because it is real data. And I think there's something about real data that students really connect with. So let's talk a little bit about modeling and equity. And as we think about the intersection of these two things, I'd like you to reflect on these two questions. And you're welcome to just reflect individually, or if you would like to use the group chat, you're welcome to respond there. But I'd like you to think about, in your setting, who gets to do the modeling? Is modeling for all students? Is modeling for only your AP Stats kids? Is modeling reserved for the math league or a math club? Or do all students, regardless of what courses they are in, get a chance to do modeling? And we saw that many of you had said modeling is not happening or rarely happening or depends. And I'm wondering where you do see modeling lacking. What do you think some of the causes are? So just take a moment to think about those two questions. And again, you can think about them quietly or add your responses into the group chat. So let's think about some of the benefits of modeling. As we were talking about, it's so interesting to think about this idea of bringing in previous learned mathematics into the tasks that are at the sophistication of high school level. So as we know, many educators face the challenge of tackling unfinished learning from previous grades. Modeling is a great opportunity to do so. We also know that modeling gives us the opportunity to do mathematics that are based in real-world applications. And it also gives us the opportunity to explore social justice issues. NCTM put out a paper about access and equity in math education that says providing all students with access is not enough. Educators must have the knowledge, skills, and disposition necessary to support effective, equitable mathematics teaching and learning. So when I think about what that means for high school students giving experiences with high-intensity modeling, it makes me think that students shouldn't only be getting access to the problems, though that is great. We also need to make sure that in our schools, we're giving teachers opportunities to collaborate around modeling, get professional learning around modeling, so that they can feel as prepared as possible to go through the process with students. I mentioned one of the benefits is to tackle some social justice issues, and there's this Flint water crisis task. There's a few different versions online if you haven't seen it. It talks about some companies that were going to donate some water for school children in Michigan, and they mentioned that they're going to collectively donate water to meet the daily needs of over 10,000 school children for the balance of the calendar year. And so to do so, they're going to send 176 truckloads of water, up to 6.5 million bottles to Flint. And the basic questions are, how do we know how much water is going to be enough? And is the company's plan a good one? So really tackling this problem mathematically also allows an opportunity to talk about this particular crisis. There's a lot of ideas like this. We held a contest this summer for a modeling task connected with the social justice issue, and the winning task is going to be added to the Coherence map next year, talking about how long it'll take for the U.S. to fill one football-sized field landfill with trash with a certain height. There's a task around is it worth paying more for a hybrid car? Investigating the mathematics behind gerrymandering, examining national debt, estimating crowd sizes. If you're thinking about conserving water, is there a benefit of taking a shower versus a bath, and so on. So depending on the topics your students are interested in, or topics that are current, something that they're currently thinking about, doing modeling tasks around those topics can be really powerful. And I'm going to pass it back to Pascal.
Thank you, Barbara. And our next presenter could not be here with us this evening. Her name is Kate Nowak. She is Director of K-12 Curriculum Strategy for Illustrative Mathematics, but she did record her portion of the presentation. So please bear with me as we start to play her video.
Hi, this is Kate Nowak from Illustrative Mathematics. I'm here to talk about some ways we've thought about helping teachers implement high-quality modeling tasks and things we've included in IM's high school curriculum to help teachers be more successful when they do. So I want to talk a little bit about dimensions of modeling, which are ways to adjust the demands of a task to make it a heavier lift or a lighter lift for a student. Some ways we think about building in opportunities to work on modeling skills within regular old classroom lessons. Then talk about a component of the IM high school curriculum we've developed called a modeling prompt, which allows students to engage in more extended, authentic modeling than you might have time for within a single class period. And then finally, some resources and scaffolds and ways we've tried to make this feel more doable and set it up so that classrooms can be more successful when they engage in modeling. So here's the thing. It's tempting to look at a task and say, oh, in this task, students are doing modeling, and in this task, they're not. But what we found in researching this pretty deeply is that it's not so binary. There's a whole lot of gray area in the work we can ask a student to do in lots of different facets of a task. So I'm going to dig into one example to show what the heck I'm talking about here. The 5 different ways we settled on thinking about how we could adjust a task are listed on the screen here. So let's just dig into one, the last one, that's called the model. In a given modeling task, typically the modeler is coming up with a way to represent and simplify a relationship in the real world. So you can use math to describe, learn, make predictions, etc. Having to just take raw data or a description of a situation and figure out what type of model to use and figure out all the parameters involved, that's the most difficult question to ask. We've described that as a heavy lift. There's a prompt in our Algebra 2 course about modeling the period of a pendulum in relation to its length. And the most difficult way to present this would be to say, what are some variables that might affect the period of a pendulum after you spend some time so that students understand what it even means to say the period of a pendulum. They might guess the length, they might guess how heavy it is, how far you draw it up before you let it go. And they can test those hypotheses out, figure out what things do have a big effect, and then create a model. This is really difficult and probably not something you'd want to give to a student who is new to modeling. We could also give a version that's more of a medium lift. So this is an example of a way we varied the specific prompt, which is to say, we're going to tell you to vary the length and use a stopwatch and record the period of the pendulum for different lengths and make a scatter plot, and then give a list of possibilities what type of function looks like the best fit. So this version is a lighter lift. It's not so daunting, and there are some handholds to grab onto when you're coming up with the model. And then in the lightest possible lift, we can say, okay, here's the model. And they've still done data collection, created a scatter plot, but we give them this representation and tell them which parameters to adjust until they have a good model. The point being that for any modeling task we might decide is a good one to present to students, there are lots of different ways to make it a heavier or a lighter lift. In the IM high school curriculum, we identified 5 of these things to vary so that we could give different versions of our modeling prompts. These aren't the only 5 things you could vary. When we first started working, we came up with like 13 or 14 things. But to simplify things a bit, we decided to focus on the 5 we thought were the most meaningful and impactful. And I'll provide some links in a bit to read more about what these other dimensions mean, what it looks like to dial them up or down. So you also don't need to wait until you're giving like a big deal extended modeling task where they engage in the whole modeling cycle and they're going to iterate on the model and come up with a presentation of what they come up with. You can be building in these skills and students can be flexing those muscles just within regular math lessons. So this is an example that's somewhat related to swing time. So this is just an activity from a classroom lesson. A person has chosen to model the shape of this arch with a graph, and they constructed a model based on where the x-intercepts of the graph are. And it turns out this model, capital H, is not very good. It does go through those x-intercepts, but it's way too tall. So this activity is about scaling the outputs of a function, but within this activity, we're making it about improving a model. These types of activities within our curriculum, we've labeled with this instructional routine called aspects of mathematical modeling. So that's a signal that there's an opportunity to build those skills. So they're available when you get to a more involved modeling prompt. And I counted earlier today, and there are about 60 of these activities sprinkled throughout the high school courses. So when we were constructing the architecture of IM's high school curriculum, we realized that our structure for middle school of having instructional units composed of lessons, composed of activities, and lessons are meant to take one class meeting, that those learning experiences really weren't enough for students to engage in authentic modeling, by which we mean being able to experiment, to make authentic choices, to generate cases, being able to iterate on their first model, refine it, come up with a better one. So this is a screen grab from our Algebra 2 course. In addition to our typical units and lesson plans, we have a whole other kind of thing that's called a modeling prompt. So if you were to click on that tab that the red arrow is pointing to, you'll find a collection of these things for the Algebra 2 course. They live outside the normal structure of daily lesson plans. And the analogy we draw is something like a research paper or a writing piece that might happen in a humanities class where you're assigned a paper, but you're still attending daily lessons, but the assignment is ongoing in the background. So these are the modeling prompts that are in Algebra 2. Each of these is meant to be launched during class time, but then they're meant to take more than one class period to finish. Maybe students have time in class, maybe they spend some time outside of class. You'll notice that for each of them under the title, it says which lesson the prompt could be used after, which doesn't mean you have to use it exactly at that point. It means anytime after that point, that after that lesson, to tackle the prompt. So the teacher has the discretion to use them whenever it makes sense. We also don't presume that a teacher is going to use all 8 of these every year. It could be enough to pick, say, 3 of them that you think are the most interesting to your students. Or you might allow students to choose a topic and present some of these as different options. Okay, so if we click on swing time there, it looks like this. Each modeling prompt that we provide has at least 2 versions. So the arrow at the top is pointing to task statement 2. And this one, swing time, has exactly 2 versions. So what's different is that we vary things on those 5 dimensions. The arrow at the bottom points to a little table that communicates how heavy is the lift on those 5 dimensions. The example that we're looking at here is the lighter lift. There's another version that represents a heavier lift. So teachers have choices to make about what version to give. You might choose a lighter lift when students are less experienced modelers and a heavier one when they're more experienced. Or you might allow students to choose which version they think they're ready for so they can differentiate for themselves, which can work quite well. Even with multiple versions of each prompt, we found teachers were asking, our pilot teachers were asking for a more gradual on-ramp to help their students be successful getting started with modeling. So an additional resource we provide in each course is the very first modeling prompt. Students aren't doing any modeling. They're given someone else's response, a fake person's response to a prompt. And the task is to understand the response, evaluate it, see if they can find ways to refine it, make it better. So there's a whole prompt that's just about giving them a chance to look at someone else's work and see what it looks like when somebody does it before they have a chance to try one. We also provide an evaluation or a scoring rubric. This is just the first page, but when evaluating that first response, we recommend giving students this rubric and asking them to apply it and use it to look for ways to make the given response better. So this is all in service of sort of helping students understand what's involved in modeling and what it takes to respond to a prompt. So if you'd like to learn more about our approach in the IM High School curriculum to mathematical modeling, this is the place to go take a look. Down at the bottom there in the teacher guide, there's a section called Mathematical Modeling Prompts. And that goes a lot deeper into some of the things I talked about today. It also goes into some things I didn't mention today. So I just want to wrap up with a few pointers to getting students to engage in mathematical modeling, even if you're not sure where to start. The first is don't sleep on modeling and don't give up on it. You really can't say you're addressing the high school standards unless students have a chance to do this work. So make sure you make time for it, which might involve even taking a look at things you are spending time on that aren't quite as important and making smart choices. Look for ways to build the skills required for modeling into your typical lessons and activities. So modeling doesn't have to be reserved for big projects or giant tasks or prompts. It's a good on-ramp to this work to show students examples of what other people have come up with as responses to modeling type tasks, and ask students to understand those responses, evaluate them, use a scoring rubric if you have one, and apply it to someone else's responses, and look for ways they would improve or refine it. And then finally, understand and think about those different dimensions along which you can vary the modeling demands of a task, dialing them down at first, and then gradually increasing the demands as students become more comfortable and more experienced modelers. So thanks very much for the chance to contribute to this webinar today, and I look forward to talking to people in the future. Bye.
Great. So glad to have Kate join us. 2 resources that she talked about, and we will put the links to these in the group chat is a really nice one-pager on advice on modeling, and this is specifically for students to have kind of as a guide as they're attacking some of these problems. And another is some of these questions that might still be on your mind. How often, Kate mentioned, and we read in the Coherence map, perhaps one of these longer type tasks, maybe once a quarter makes sense. How long do they take? Some can take a couple days, or it could be a project that is used across time. But there are also some tasks on the Coherence map that really tackle just a small bit of the cycle that can be done in a short period of time, maybe 10 minutes in the classroom, but it gives students a chance to do something that is a little less procedural and requires them to use some of the strategies of modeling. There's options for choices around independent work, group work, projects in class, and again, this link can really help support with some guidance around that. The last one was, should the math represent what's being taught in that unit? Again, we want to give students opportunities to do modeling in the mathematics that they're learning, but also give them a chance to do modeling around other topics where they can bring in the mathematics that makes sense too, that it makes sense for them to do. So that wraps up our webinar, and we want to move on for some questions. I'm going to kick off with one question that came in already in the Q&A, which was, my textbooks do not have good modeling problems. It's time-consuming to find or create good modeling problems. And another person who said that the modeling is lacking because of the curriculum that's being used. Hopefully, from this webinar, you have learned that we have about 16 tasks as a beginning on the Coherence map that we hope that you grab and try out. And we also have seen that on Illustrated Math High School curriculum, there's modeling prompts that can also be used. I saw in the group chat some people were sharing some good modeling tasks, opportunities, and we're continuing at Achieve the Core Student Achievement Partners, continue trying to build out our modeling tasks on the Coherence map, and they're always welcome for suggestions if you have a task either that exists currently or one that you are interested in creating yourself. We'd love to talk to you about that. The next question I will put out to Scott. Scott, how do we teach the modeling process and work around potential deficits in reading comprehension?
Great question. I know that affects all of us. There's certainly a lot of students by high school who don't have the reading skills that we would hope that they would have at that point. I think the important thing is to make sure that they still get a true mathematical modeling experience, and they get to still work through high-level mathematics and high-level modeling. And so, I think we don't always assume it, but sometimes as math teachers, we also have to be reading teachers, and we have to find strategies to help them scaffold the reading for them so that we don't diminish the mathematics, but we still give them the opportunity to engage in the mathematics. One thing that RP suggested would be to really support them with the problem phase of the modeling cycle so that they can get full access to the problem itself and to really understand what the context is and what the question is asking them to build a model around and interpret and determine so that they can fully engage in the process, even if the reading might otherwise hold them back.
Great, thanks, Scott. We are out of time for questions, but if you submit them, we will be sure to email you a response. So Pascal, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you for the audience for joining us this evening. Please join our network. Connect with state networks through our Core Advocate Network. You'll also have opportunities to gain access to free resources, learn about upcoming SAP webinars, professional learning opportunities. A lot of benefits come from joining the Core Advocate Network. And these are all of the links that you could have access to any of our social media or also signing up. And please come back again next month for our webinar, New Year, New Perspective, Questions Every Educator Should Ask Themselves when Planning and Reflecting. It will be January 8th, 2020 at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is the link that you can use to register. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a very great evening.